Let's get started on the last section in Chapter 5, TCP/IP protocols. Now, we have already looked at some TCP/IP protocols. You already know that IP sends packets and that TCP sends acknowledgments, and that the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol issues IP addresses to workstations, and that the domain name system performs host name resolution. But let's look at some other TCP/IP protocols, and they fall into three general categories: application layer protocols, transport layer protocols, and internet layer protocols. Let's start out with application layer protocols. Now, the first two application layer protocols we are already familiar with, the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol and DNS. But let's look at some of these other protocols as well. Let's start out with HTTP. Well, I think everybody knows what HTTP is. It's called the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, but what it's used for is for surfing the internet, for going to web page. That's HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. If you surf the internet, you know what HTTP is. Now, another protocol is called the File Transfer Protocol. And if somebody says, I am going to FTP a file to you, what they mean is they're going to transfer the file to you. The File Transfer Protocol simply means you're going to copy a file. And FTP allows you to copy files to remote computers across the internet. It allows you to copy files from the hard disk of your computer to the hard disk of a remote computer. To start FTP, it is a command line utility, and you type FTP followed by the IP address of the remote computer that you want to connect to. And then when you are connected to that remote computer, you can copy files up to the hard disk of the remote computer, or you can copy files down from the hard disk of the computer. An FTP server is simply a computer that you can save files to using the FTP, the File Transfer Protocol. Now, let's look at Telnet. Like FTP, Telnet is also a command line interface, and it allows you to run programs on remote computers, whereas FTP simply allows you to copy files to the hard disks of remote computers. Telnet allows you to run programs on other computers. So to connect to a remote computer, I would type Telnet followed by the IP address of that remote computer. And then once I was connected, anything that I typed at the command prompt right here would actually apply to the remote computer. So if I were to type, for example, format space C colon, that would format the disk on the remote computer. Telnet allows you to run programs on remote computers. So what's the difference between Telnet and FTP? They are similar. They are similar in that they're both command line interfaces, but FTP simply allows you to copy files to the hard disks of remote computers, where Telnet allows you to actually run programs on remote computers. Remote desktop is very similar to Telnet in that it allows you to log into remote computers and to run programs, but the difference is it uses a graphical user interface. If I'm at my computer here and I want to connect to a server over at Essex to create a user or to delete a user, and I don't want to drive over at Essex, I would use remote desktop to connect to the server too. So what I would do is I would use the remote desktop connection, and I would connect to server2.ccbc.edu, and then I would connect. And then when I did, my remote desktop screen would show that I was connected to a server. Notice I have two start buttons here. If I click on the start button in the very bottom left-hand corner, then I would be starting programs on the computer where I am currently standing. However, in this window that says remote desktop, if I click on this start button, then I would be starting programs on the remote computer, on the server. So you can see that in the remote desktop Windows screen, I have access to Server Manager, and that allows me to create and delete users on the remote server. Remote desktop allows us to remotely connect to servers to configure and manage them. The difference between Telnet and remote desktop, well, they both allow you to run programs on remote computers, but Telnet is command line only and remote desktop is graphical user interface. Another application layer protocol is the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. The purpose of the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol is to push email from one email server to the next. It allows email servers to communicate with each other. That was application layers. Now let's look at transport layer protocols. And we have only two transport layer protocols to deal with. The TCP protocol, which you're already familiar with. The TCP protocol identifies the port number and it sends acknowledgments. And then the UDP protocol identifies the port number, but it does not send acknowledgments. Well, why would you want that? Well, an acknowledgment has increased overhead. If you send a packet, it takes a certain amount of bandwidth. But if an acknowledgment comes back, then that's going to take even more bandwidth. So if you're going to send a broadcast to hundreds of computers, you really don't want those computers to send acknowledgments. That's why we use the UDP protocol, to send out packets that we don't want to get acknowledgments to. But both TCP and both UDP identify the port number. So let's talk about what is a port number. A port is a field in an IP header that identifies the destination program or service. So let's review what's meant by an IP header. An IP packet has data information and header information. And the header information, as you know, contains the IP address. In the packet, we've got the data, such as ABC, and the header includes the IP address, the destination of the computer, But there is another field in the IP header, and that specifies port number, and the port number specifies the program that this packet is going to. The IP address specifies what computer it's going to, and the port number specifies what program it's going to on that computer. For example, if it's port number 80, it is web traffic. And if it's port number 21, it is FTP traffic. We will cover ports later in this class because a firewall can be used to allow or deny traffic based upon port numbers. So when we talk about firewalls in the security section of the class, we will be talking about port numbers at that time. Now, let's talk about the third category, TCP/IP internetwork layer protocols. Now, you already know what the IP protocol is. It's called the Internet Protocol, and it sends packets and performs routing. Now, I didn't mention it, but the Internet Control Message Protocol is really the protocol that is associated with ping. When you're using ping, you're using the Internet Control Message Protocol. And then the last protocol is called the ARP, the Address Resolution Protocol. And what that does is it resolves IP addresses to MAC addresses. And as you know, a MAC address is a serial number which is burned into the network interface card. In summary, in this section we looked at TCP/IP protocols, some of which you are already familiar with. DHCP, DNS, HTTP, TP, and Telnet, FTP and Remote Desktop Protocol, and the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. We looked at the transfer protocols such as TCP and UDP, and we looked at the Internet layer protocols such as IP, ICMP, and the Address Resolution Protocol. And this concludes our section on TCP/IP protocols.